U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which I tell people is like the DNR, but it's federal. So we work on the federal side of things. And I work for our migratory birds program here in the Twin Cities. So, and we're going to be kind of bouncing back and forth. We're going to be trading off. All right. So first, I just kind of want to tell you about sort of, who we are and the work that we do. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has what we call an urban bird treaty program, and it's a certification that cities can get. It's a certification given by the Fish and Wildlife Service. It, makes cities that are part of this certification more competitive for federal grants. And it's based on partnerships and on the ground collaboration. There's three goals or three pillars of this program, which are habitat restoration and improvement, threat reduction, like reducing window strikes, light pollution, toxins, outdoor cats, and then also community engagement, especially with previously underrepresented communities. And it works with the Fish and Wildlife's Urban Refuge Program. It started in 1999. We have 31 cities so far. The Twin Cities became an urban bird treaty program in 2011, I believe. And these are just some of the partners. It's a group of a bunch of different organizations, and everybody's doing their own awesome work, but we get together about once a month and kind of share what we're working on, see if there's ways that we can collaborate. So this is a not comprehensive list of the partners, and I forgot to add Dakota County is a new member of this group, Parks and Rec, but Monica's up there with the Urban Bird Collective, Minnesota Valley. Here's just kind of some examples of other things that we've done, working on retrofits, doing outreach at schools, doing dark sky events. So Mags Edwards and I are part of this larger group. And within that larger group, there's a smaller subgroup for working with chimney swifts. So I am going to hand this over to Mags Edwards.
Or should I just use it? I'll forget about it and like put it in my pocket or something. So thanks, Mags, one, for the kind of overview of how, what our group is and sort of how we got together and started working on stuff together. I'd like to just sort of go over what chimney swifts are. Whoa, that's loud. Okay. So I would imagine that a lot of people in this room might already be familiar with chimney swifts, but if not, they're a really interesting bird. They're an aerial insectivore. And part of what is really interesting about them is that they only roost on vertical structures. So they're distributed throughout Minnesota. And Mags will talk about this a little bit later, but they historically nested in, natural structures, but they became really adapted to nesting in brick and mortar chimneys and other types of chimney. They're distributed across the eastern half of the United States. We have another species of swift in the United States called Fox's swift. They're, on the western area of the U.S. Chimney swifts are the only species of swift that we have in Minnesota. And part of what makes them really interesting and really compelling to study is that they have this communal roosting behavior. So throughout the breeding season, but specifically during migration in the spring and the fall, they roost communally. And it can be, tens, hundreds, thousands of swifts all sharing the same structure. And it's really quite a spectacle to witness. So if anybody is not familiar with what they look like or how to identify them, they're very small, slender. They're pretty, I guess, nondescript, except that they're beautiful and completely well adapted to what they're doing. They have these very long, narrow, curved wings. They have long primaries and short secondaries, which make them really well adapted to gliding and also aerial acrobatics. And as I mentioned before, they have these super small feet that are only with long claws that are only adapted to clinging to vertical surfaces. They do not perch on horizontal surfaces, wires, branches, or anything like that. And I put in there a fun fact that their family name means without feet, although of course they do actually have feet, you just don't see them. Do I need to change something? Oh, thank you. I'm really short. They also, no, it's completely fine. They also have stiff tail feathers, you know, kind of similar to a lot of woodpecker species that help keep them kind of propped against whatever vertical surface they're perching on. And you can kind of see this in this, you can see those tail feathers in this image here, and I have a couple other images as well. And I hope people can read this. I tried to maybe cram in too much information. As far as how to identify them, which I like to describe them as a gateway bird because they're actually everywhere and they're pretty easy to identify. And once you start noticing them, you'll probably notice them all around you. Not right now because it's October, but you know, starting in the spring and throughout the summer and fall, they're widespread and they're easy to find once you notice. People describe them as a flying cigar, and I wish I could think of something better, but it's super accurate. So I don't know what to say. But they're kind of tapered in front, tapered in back. They have this kind of high-pitched chittering call that's really distinctive. And especially when you have a group of them together, it's really easy to notice. But even if there's just one, you know, coming over you as you're outside for a walk, it's really easy to distinguish. They have these long, slender, scythe-shaped wings. Their underparts are generally not very pale. They might have a little bit of paleness, but overall they're pretty brown. And again, the vertical roosting and nesting is absolutely giveaway. If you see a bird perched on anything else, it is almost certainly not a swift. So our most similar species that they might get confused with in Minnesota are swallows. If you see any flashes of color or iridescence, that's almost certainly not a swift. If you see it perched anywhere that's not vertical, probably not a swift. Swallow wings tend to be a little bit shorter and stubbier, like they have a wider base and they taper more quickly. I think they almost look a little bit more like a jet or like a starling, whereas the swift wings are really pretty long and tapered. Swallows have a variety of different tail types depending on the species, whereas swifts, they almost look like they have no tail at all when you see them in flight. Swallows tend to flap a little bit more, whereas swifts do kind of like a flap flap and a glide. Their movements tend to be a little bit quicker. And in general, and of course these are all, or some of these are mostly generalizations, swifts tend to hunt a little bit higher in the air column than swallows do generally. And I should note, I think I had a note about this in here somewhere, but I'm not sure. Swifts spend almost all of their waking hours on the wing. Like they're in the air the entire time unless they're asleep or feeding their young. And just, I didn't want to exhaustively put a bunch of swallow pictures in here because I thought it would be boring. But we have 6 species of swallow in Minnesota. You know, anybody can check it out. The purple martin, barn swallow, bank swallow, cliff swallow, ruffed-winged swallow, and the tree swallow. So all of those have characteristics that would differentiate them from a swift. In Minnesota, I would like to talk a little bit about their nesting ecology. So they're a regular breeding resident and a migrant throughout Minnesota. And this map is taken from the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas, so anybody can go look at it. They are largely focused in urban areas because they've become adapted to using our structures as their structures. They tend to arrive in April or May and usually depart in kind of the mid-fall, September to October. It's very dependent on the weather and other conditions. Um, as I mentioned, they roost communally during migration and to some extent during the breeding season. And what I mean by that is only one pair will nest per structure, per chimney, or per hollow tree or whatever it is, but they may allow other birds to kind of co-roost with them, but not nest. And they may also have helper birds that will help feed the young. And there's a lot more information available on the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas, and also on Cornell's All About Birds, of course, which I assume people know about. And then I think this is a transition slide.
Okay, it's back to the other mags. I feel weird saying mags one because that makes me. Okay, all right, I can be mags one. All right. I don't want to assume I'm more important, but all right, we're different heights apparently. All right. As I mentioned before, in our Twin Cities Urban Bird Conservation Group, when we were identifying goals of what our group wanted to do, there was a pretty strong interest in doing Chimney Swift conservation. And so, as I mentioned before, we formed kind of this smaller subgroup. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of swifts in the U.S. and kind of, um, you know, how they used to nest and roost and kind of how they are now, but also kind of some threats that they're facing. So, you know, they nest and roost in chimneys, and people say, well, what did they do before there were chimneys? And they would nest and roost in caves. These are actually black swiftlets in Asia, but you know, kind of similar vibe. They would roost or nest in big old growth snags. A lot of bald cypress. A lot of the southeast before colonialization was, you know, a lot of, you know, old growth, swampy, um, you know, habitat. And, you know, people think that they probably roosted and nested in these areas. Oh, Borneo. I have a note. The black swiftlets are from Borneo. Um, and so as you know, as the US became colonized by, you know, European settlers, and we started moving our you know, the westward march of industrialism, and here's the Pillsbury Mill, and we started building buildings and chimneys, and they loved them. They're like, this is so much better to nest in and roost in. And so, you know, they still will nest and roost in trees and cliffs, but I mean, pretty much most of the time they are just nesting and roosting in man-made habitats. And you know, they followed their population followed the westward expansion. Um, and as Mags two mentioned, so the picture on the left, there's actually three chimney swifts in there. There's one on the nest, and there's one right below the nest, and then there's one to the left. And they like to just, you know, a pair nest in a chimney. They'll try to keep the other ones out. Sometimes they'll have helper birds, probably young from previous years. And they build this really, really not very structurally sound nest. It's just sort of a half of a cup nest. And if you've ever heard of bird's nest soup, that, you know, is kind of a delicacy in Asia, it's not this species, but it is cliff nesting swifts. And so basically this is made out of twigs and bird spit, and they just kind of glue it to the side of a structure. And this is what bird's nest soup is, you know, vegetation and bird spit. And um, and then as the chicks get bigger, they're, you know, they do fall out of the nest sometimes because the nest is not very structurally sound. But the nice thing is that it just kind of disintegrates over the winter. It doesn't really make a mess in the chimney. They have these weird little alien babies And the nice thing about nesting in a really secure, protected area is that you can take quite a while to, learn how to fly. And so they actually spend a couple months, before the chicks leave the chimney, just because it's a safe environment. So here's a, parent with some young chicks and some bigger chicks. The parents will take turns feeding the chicks or sitting on the nest. They kind of scoop up a bunch of bugs in the air and they make this big bolus of insects, and then they kind of, cough it up for the chicks. So that's the nesting. And we also have the roosting behaviors that Mags mentioned, where in the spring and the fall, kind of on the shoulder season of migration, they will just pack into these chimneys. And they're very communal birds. They're very social. They're out during the day. They don't like to be out at night. And it's a really interesting spectacle, and it's a really, as Mags mentioned, it's a gateway bird, but it's a really good species to have community education or community science with, because unlike observing other birds, I mean, these birds do not care if you're there. I mean, you can bring your kids and your dogs and you can have a barbecue and you can have your lawn chairs, and they really do not care about you. And so it's a really great way to bring the community in and to, show this really awesome, event. So I wanted to mention, we talk about they're not here in the winter, and we say, well, where do they go? And they go somewhere in that blue zone that's like, several million square miles, Amazon basin, that we're like, yeah, somewhere in there. And we really don't know very much. Back in the 30s, there was this huge banding effort. And, several 100,000 chimney swifts were banded all over the eastern US. And they would get, they would get adults return, year after year. So they knew that they were migrating somewhere, but we didn't know where. And then in the 40s, and this is a very Shaggy Dog story, but someone was working with indigenous people in Peru, and there was a tribe that gave this person a gift of jewelry, and the jewelry was chimney swift bands that the indigenous people were using as jewelry, and they gave it to this person as a gift. And then it changed hands, and it eventually wound up with the embassy, who gave it to the State Department, who gave it to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's this so nobody quite knows exactly where they came from, but and when they looked at the bands, they realized that these bands were put on swifts all over the eastern US. So they didn't just come from one place, but they all wound up in one place. And so there were 13 bands that were recovered, and that is really the totality of what we know about their wintering area. Um, so so now I want to talk a little bit about conservation of these chimney swifts. And there are certain threats that we know about. And one of them is that, they really like man-made structures. And with new construction, people don't really need chimneys anymore. So with new buildings, we're not building chimneys. And we're excluding existing chimneys because people don't want raccoons and squirrels and things in them, or we're running HVAC systems up through the chimneys. And so we're not creating new habitat for them. And what we're also doing is we're destroying old habitat. This is the Elliott School, which was in St. Louis Park. This picture was taken in 1958. You can see that there's a really nice, almost smokestack that they probably used for a furnace or a boiler. And we have records of lots of chimney swifts. I mean, not as many as Matamidi, but 300 or 400 swifts using this, every night in the spring and the fall. And someone documented, that was torn down, in 2014. You can see the chimney was the last thing to go, and now it is condos. So that's same location. And so we're losing habitat because as a society, we like to build new things and bigger things. And so, that's one of the major threats is loss of this nesting and roosting habitat. There's, here's a scary picture I found, but there's a bunch of other things that are probably potential threats that we don't have as much information on. Probably loss of habitat on the wintering ground, climate change, pesticides that are decreasing their food, collisions with buildings. These are all things that, yeah, probably aren't helping. But the bottom line is, since the 1970s, we have lost about 67% of chimney swift populations. You can see this in the Breeding Bird Atlas from Minnesota. And also this is from Birds Canada. So we are in a pretty steep decline of chimney swift populations. And it's estimated that in the next 27 years, we're probably going to lose 50% more of what we have now. So it's a big concern. And these are, it's sort of a catch-all phrase for birds is called common birds in steep decline. They're everywhere. We see them, but they're not doing well. And so people realized this and started kind of sounding the alarm. And this is Paul and Georgina Kyle in Texas. They were toy makers turned wildlife rehabbers. And sometimes people would bring them chimney swift chicks. And so they started rehabbing them. And then they said, okay, well, can we build fake chimneys for them? And so they started building these freestanding towers to see if the chimney swifts would use them. And they did. They would nest in them, they would use them. And so in 1995, the Kyles founded the North American Chimney Swift Nest Site Research Project. And this turned into a continent-wide initiative. And they really encourage people to do swift sits and swift night outs all over the species range, and also building these freestanding nesting and roosting towers. They included plans, they had books, and these the Kyles were just instrumental in bringing awareness and conservation efforts across the chimney swift range. And so part of that is there was this big effort about 10 years ago, and it's still going on, to build these chimney swift towers, which I have dubbed Kyle style after the Kyles, because if I say man-made structures, it's all man-made. So to differentiate them from masonry, brick and mortar chimneys. These towers were pretty cheap and easy to build. You can build one for about $200. You can, put it up in a weekend, and they're great projects for Boy Scout groups, civic groups, churches, schools. And they were generally put up by Audubon groups, and we don't have any kind of comprehensive database as to how many of them were constructed. But that really took off. Here's Pennsylvania, here's one in Maryland, here's one in North Carolina, here's one in Illinois. It was a project that seemed really feasible, and it seemed like that this was going to help with the chimney swift decline. And in Minnesota, between 2011 and 2016, Minnesota Audubon helped build a bunch of these Kyle-style towers. Originally, there was 150 planned statewide, 70 of which in the Twin Cities. And by the time our Chimney Swift subgroup started talking about this, a lot of those original partners from this effort had, moved on or retired or taken other positions. And so we didn't have a whole lot of information about these towers. And so we had some initial questions, like, can these towers be a useful tool for chimney swift recovery? And should we focus our efforts on maintaining existing towers and building new ones? So those were kind of our questions. This was fall of 2021. So we want to know, there were all these towers planned. Were they actually ever built? And were they monitored? Were they maintained? Are they still there? Can we get to where they are? Can we, are they on private land? Are they accessible? And do chimney swifts use them? And, are these towers useful for, for education? Even if swifts aren't using them, is there signage? Can people learn about these birds? So we started this study in fall 2021, spring 2022. And initially this involved just running down 10-year-old data, doing site visits, Google Street View, calling people, doing, trying to find out anybody who knew, who was here, building these initial towers. And some of these sites we couldn't get access to. They were on private land. They were behind fences. Some of them, weren't there. They weren't built, or they'd been removed. Some of the sites we removed from monitoring because they didn't seem safe, to go and do surveys. And also there weren't a ton of us. There was just sort of a handful of us that were monitoring these towers in addition to our other job duties. So so we found out that 125 of the original 150 planned were built in Minnesota and 50 of which were built in the Twin Cities. So we focused on publicly accessible sites, schools, parks, and we chose 20 towers to do a pilot study. And we found out that there hadn't been any monitoring done that we could find. There weren't records of, of if Swifts had been using these. So in the summer 2022, we did site visits, these 25 towers. We used monitoring protocol from other Swift groups. During the nesting season, May through July, we monitored 12 towers for nesting activity. And then in August and September, we monitored 7 towers and 4 just brick and mortar buildings in August and September to see if anybody was roosting in them. So the results. So a lot of the landowners that we contacted didn't know what the towers were. They're like, oh yeah, that's here. I don't know what's bats, maybe, I don't know. Or they didn't really care. The landowners that did kind of know what was going on said, yeah, we've never seen birds use them. And some of the towers weren't placed in great habitat. You can see this one here. This is Dodge Nature Center. It's kind of in a raspberry patch. It's not the easiest thing to get into, places with a lot of vegetation growth. And, a lot of them were sort of in disrepair as well. This one's leaning, gosh, I can't remember what the site is, but it was very wooded and very secluded, and I did not enjoy going there to check it by myself. I can't remember it's in the Twin Cities. So when these towers were built, monitoring and maintenance of them was never part of the original plan. It was sort of a, if you build it, they will come. And a lot of these towers weren't doing well. You can see this tower here. This is at Garlow Elementary. It's kind of leaning to the side. This one here is, has a bunch of woodpecker holes in it. And then we looked at the signage. So we looked at 22 of these towers to see if they had signs. A lot of times the signage was absent or it wasn't legible. 13 had some signage and 9 had none of them. So some of these, the signage was really weathered. You really couldn't read what it said. Some of them you could read what it said, sort of, but it didn't really tell you a whole lot about what the tower was for. And only 2 of them had educational signage talking about chimney swifts and what they were used for. We also, on a lot of them, we took some tools, and outside the nesting season, we opened them up to look inside, see if there were any nests. And a lot of these were just immaculate. Like they were 10 years old and they were very tidy inside. And it really didn't look like anything had been nesting in it. We didn't see any chimney swifts using them when we did our surveys. We didn't see any nesting or roosting. After our study was done, we did observe 1 swift going in one of these towers at Fort Snelling, at the historic Fort Snelling site. We don't know if they were nesting or just checking it out, but Fort Snelling, pretty much every single chimney on the fort has chimney swifts nesting in it because they're these great old masonry chimneys. They don't have covers on them. And, it's possible that that was just sort of an overflow bird, but that's one that we saw outside of the study. The interesting thing is sometimes when we were checking out towers, a lot of times we would see swifts in the area, and they weren't using the towers, they were using the masonry chimneys that were, so they had a choice, and they were choosing the masonry chimneys. So we started talking to other groups, and before I go on, I have to tell you this because I tell people that so a lot of chimney swift work was done in Ontario, in London, Ontario, which is that star on the right hand side. And I tell people that we are further north than London, Ontario, and they don't believe me. But so here you can see on the map we are physically further north than parts of Canada. So we started talking to other conservation groups that studied chimney swifts. We talked to Wisconsin Swift Group, Birds Canada, and they all said the same thing. Like, yeah, we don't think that these towers are what chimney swifts need up north. Like, we know they work in Texas, but they don't seem to work here, or they don't seem to be used by chimney swifts here. And our friends to the south in Toronto, Canada, as I like to call them, they did a study where they took data loggers and they measured temperature and relative humidity in chimneys that were attached to buildings, and then also some just freestanding chimneys. And what they found was really interesting. So the red line, or the very squiggly line, is temperature throughout the breeding season at the freestanding chimney. And then the blue line, which is more straight, is the temperature throughout the breeding season inside the chimney that's attached to the house. And what you can see is when you have a freestanding chimney, there's a lot of temperature variation. You've got these fluctuations going up and down a lot, and that's not always great for, trying to incubate eggs and raise chicks. And, we don't know exactly why chimney swifts aren't using these towers up here, but, one reason may be that they're not insulated enough. But, what everybody seems to be finding out is that these towers are not what the chimney swifts need up here in the north. And so, it was a little disappointing that we had this original idea and we're like, oh my gosh, like we could build more of these. It would be, and we had to kind of take a step back and say, look, negative data is still data. Like, we don't think that these Kyle style towers are a good conservation tool in Minnesota. There wasn't a lot of monitoring with the initial event. There wasn't a lot of community outreach. There was, they weren't, the planning of where to put them, wasn't sort of well thought out for, years in the future. And so, as a group, we said, look, we're not going to recommend people build these anymore. And we provided the results of the survey to the landowners, and, recommendations on how to monitor. Like, if you want to keep monitoring this tower, here's how you do it. So going back to kind of the big picture question, can these towers be a useful tool for chimney swifts? And should we focus our efforts on them? And we found out, no, we did it. We answered our question. It's no. So, they were like, wow, now what? Now what do we do? Like, we spent a couple years, we answered the question, but what do we do now? Like, the swifts still need help. So I am now going to hand it back to Mags Edwards to tell you about our pivot.
Thanks, Megs One. Wow, that's so loud again. And do I need to tilt this up, or are we good? Okay. I would like to add one thing to what Mags One said, and that is about the nest construction. And a lot of you may be familiar with how a lot of birds will get a brood patch when they're incubating eggs, like a warm patch on their breast to help keep the eggs warm. Swifts get enlarged salivary glands to to help them construct their spit nests, which I think is really awesome. So yeah, we learned that these towers are not necessarily the best tool in Minnesota. There are a few specifically constructed towers in Minnesota that have been recorded being used by swifts. But for the most part, those specific towers don't seem to be the greatest tool. Although if anybody is looking for a graduate or PhD project, I think that trying out a few different types of structures with a little bit more thermal regulation could be really cool. And we recently had somebody do that with bats with excellent and very interesting results. But for now, we've sort of documented that building these towers is not the greatest conservation tool. So we've sort of pivoted, as Meg said, to more of a community science focus on monitoring and maintaining the habitat that we do have. So at the beginning of the talk, Mag sort of described kind of our conservation group and also the Chimney Swift subgroup. That's a collaboration between, among others, DNR, Urban Bird Collective, Fish and Wildlife Service, and American Bird Conservancy. And we've kind of shifted our goals to identifying existing roosts and confirming activity in those roosts and other roosts that have previously been documented. We have an existing database
that is somewhat out of date. And so we're trying to determine if those roosts are still active, identifying nesting locations, and then monitoring these nests and communal roosts. So if we can't provide new habitat, we can protect the habitat we have and kind of try to track what's happening and monitor the populations in the locations that they're choosing to use. Oh, and I should have said, I'll just go back. I'm not sure if I have another slide with this on. I do. Thanks, Mags One. You're the best. This QR code goes to a data reporting app where anybody who witnesses swifts nesting or roosting, and I have some materials that have this on there. I have some bookmarks with some of this information that I can hand out. All you have to do is scan this with your phone. It takes you to a website. You put in where you are, what you saw, hit send. I get that information and we can start adding that to our database. So anybody who's willing to do that, it's really helpful. And once you start looking for these birds, they are everywhere. And if you ever see one going into a structure, that is super valuable information, and I definitely want to know about it. So please use this tool. So as I've been describing, you know, we need everybody's help. Like we can't be everywhere. As Mags was describing previously, we were just a few people going around trying to monitor these towers. We have other jobs, but they're a really fun and charismatic bird, and they're easy to identify and easy to observe. And if we can get more people out there looking for them, that can help us conserve their populations. So we need help from members of the public all over the state. We need reports of roosting swifts. You may have nesting swifts in your chimney. And I have some information on the bookmarks about that. They're good neighbors. So if you have them or if you know anybody who has them, I've gotten calls from condo associations that are like, oh, we have these swifts. How do we get rid of them? And I was like, you don't have to. They're fine. Like, don't worry about it. It's not like a bunch of raccoons or something. So help us monitor. And again, if you know you have them, or if they're at your business or your school or your church or your home, you can be a good Swift host. And we're done for this season because it's maybe winter, except it's 80 degrees outside. But join us in 2025. We had several really successful Swift sits this fall in conjunction with the Urban Bird Collective. So definitely shout out to that organization and thank you for teaming up with us. We've been holding them mostly at Matamidi High School just because it's a tremendous spectacle. I mean, it's like 1,000, 1,500, maybe 2,000 Swifts, you know, and a Merlin. Well, spoiler alert. But we're looking for more organizations that are more spread out across the Twin Cities Metro and even across greater Minnesota to be able to hold these sits and get people interested and involved. So don't look at the information. Please don't go to Matamidi High School on September 4th because I might not be there. Okay, and I think the next slide is a video. I don't know if the audio is gonna work. But they're my videos and I'm happy to share them after for everybody to watch. So I think I'm gonna click play and then I'm gonna hold my mic down there. Well, I'm sorry about that. I will share these. Because this one, it's an example from one of our Swift sits at Matamidi. and you can see that they're just pouring in there, and it's like, how are they doing that? Like, what do they even do when they get in there? How are they perching? Like, it's just, it's pretty amazing. Um, and as Mags was mentioning before, it's you can bring the barbecue, you can bring your kids. They don't care. It's not, you don't have to be sneaky. You're not bothering them, and so it makes it a really good kind of community activity. Um, oh, I'm gonna play this one too, and it's gonna be lame without the audio, but hang on. So this one, as was alluded to previously, a pair of Merlins discovered this copious and reliable food source, and um, they were predating these swifts, and it was really interesting. And please, everybody, go back and watch the video, when I share it, because the audio is half the fun. Um, is this still the first one? Well, let's see what happens. At some point, there's going to be a video with Merlins in it. Um, and I mean, it was just fascinating. And part of the reason in the first video we saw those swift just pouring into the chimney is that the Merlins had kept them all aloft. Like they weren't able to enter in ones and twos and threes and fives. Um, and then it became like the last minute and they all just started pouring in there. So, and in one of these, we have a Merlin tail chasing a swift and he flies right over the crowd, and it was very exciting. Um, I will reshare this later. Oh, you're right, Mags. This is the same one. Let's see what happens here. Okay, yes. Okay, you're right. That one is the final video. My apologies. Um, so as I mentioned previously, you can be a good Swift host if you know where Swifts are or you know any place that they're nesting or roosting. They're good neighbors. They don't make a mess. It's not like having a bunch of squirrels in your chimney. Um, so if you do have an older chimney or know of an older chimney, that's really valuable habitat. And we know now that swifts are still really relying on that. And many of newer and more modern chimneys are more narrow and they're lined with metal, and it makes them not suitable for swifts to roost. And instead of, if you do have a mortar or a brick and mortar chimney, instead of capping it, you can place a roof on it, like a hat. That's high enough for swifts to still be able to get in, but low enough to prevent rain or a lot of rain from getting in, which is generally about 30 centimeters. And if you do have nesting or roosting swifts, try to avoid using that chimney from about May to September when they may be in there nesting. And if you keep the fireplace damper closed, if one oops a doodle is out of that super well constructed nest, they won't fall all the way down, and they can sometimes recover that situation. And then I know this is really broad, but support healthy insect populations. Like swifts are part of a group of aerial insectivores that include other birds like swallows, nighthawks, kestrels, anything that's reliant on insects really is in trouble because our insect populations are in trouble. So planting natives, supporting a diverse and healthy insect population helps support these bird populations as well. And you can get involved. So my role is non-game wildlife community science program coordinator. Our Chimney Swift program is collaborative with Urban Bird Collective and other groups, and it's still pretty new. So we're still getting off the ground. One way that you can help, not right now, because they all went south already, but in the immediate future is reporting any use of structures by swifts. But we're going to be growing this program and we need everybody's help. So we're still in the process of updating our webpage. One way to stay apprised of any events or opportunities or trainings is to follow the Non-Game Wildlife Program on Facebook. So please check us out there. Because that would be the first place that I would post any updates. And this is the second slide. Thanks, Max One. That's the same link as before that just links to this tool. You can see it's a really quick form. These two screenshots capture the whole thing. It's basically, where were you? What did you see? Please give us some contact information in case we have any questions about your observation. And that's it. Like, it takes 2 minutes to fill out. And that's it. And I add that to a database of Swift roost and nesting locations. So anybody who submits information to this, it's really super helpful. And if anybody has questions about that, please let me know, or feel free to contact me anytime. And then I'm gonna show this video and later I'll provide it with sound. And I was chasing them around with my phone, so please, it's not the best videography of all time. I'm not even sure if that's a word. So that's the Merlin chasing a swift. Woo. He came right over the crowd. I mean, it was like, whoa. Yeah. And I have more videos that I could make available as well. We do know for sure that he got 2 or 3. So that's all the material that I have. I don't know if you want to add anything else, Mags One. Thank you from both of us. Here's our contact information. Please feel free to get in touch anytime. And we're happy to take any questions.
So questions from here.
When the swift is gonna build a nest, inside the chimney, it's all covered with soot. Now, do they make any efforts to clean the surface before they try to attach their nest?
I don't know the answer to that. So the question was, do they make any effort to clean the chimney out before they try to build their nest? I think that's probably a little bit beyond them. I have seen some information from other organizations that say it's no problem. It's good to get your chimney cleaned out, but not during that season, so that you get that creosote layer and that soot layer off there to make it easier for them to adhere their nest. But I'm not sure. Do you have more? Okay.
We got a couple online questions.
There's also one back there as well, so just keep that in mind.
We'll roll through a couple. here.
Grado.
Didn't the Swift gets injured when the chimneys were in use, heat and smoke? It sounds like you've already alluded to that, so that they can get injured if you run fire through it.
I would certainly think so.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
Can you come up here, Megs?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so typically they start, they get here in, April or May, and they're nesting in May, June, July. And so most of the time people aren't, using, their fireplaces then. And a lot of the chimneys that they use, especially for roosting, are not functional. The Matamidi, I think, was, a coal burning furnace for the school. And so a lot of these, are just kind of sealed at the bottom. They're not really used anymore, just because we, don't use coal burning furnaces that much anymore.
And I'll just add to that, there are a lot. That's one conservation measure we can take, is like, even if you're not using the chimney, if it's not doing any harm and it's not posing a structural hazard, then just leave it there. Because the birds can still use it, and that's helpful.
Yeah, I just had a question about, I've seen them in old school buildings, and I mean, not in the buildings, in the chimneys of the old school buildings. And one time I called the principal at Matamidi and said, do you know you have this great colony? And he said, I had no idea. And I'm just wondering, have you made contact with school principals and, building engineers and that sort of thing yet?
We have, it can be a little bit of a mixed bag. So there are people at Montemita who know that exists. There have been a couple of science teachers or educators in similar roles who are like, yes, this is great. We want to monitor this. And there can be a lot of misconceptions about animals in a chimney. And so we've been somewhat hesitant to reach out to groups, at least in a broad sense, because, you know, if somebody calls an organization and says, hey, did you know that you have 400 birds in your chimney? Their reaction might be like, oh, well, we better cap that immediately. Like, we can't be having that. That sounds like a hazard. So it's a touchy situation.
Is this, okay. Yeah, one thing that we're wanting to do in the future is, kind of really incorporate the communities that use these buildings, because schools and churches aren't just used, during the day, they're used at night for, basketball leagues and AA meetings and Boy Scout groups. And so, you know, these people are already there using this. And so we, instead of reaching out to like the school administrator, we'd like to try to, kind of get support from the inside of, people who are using this. And we, inadvertently, when we were at St. Mark's, there was a bunch of people. So we were there for a Swift sit, and there was an event there, and all these people started coming out as the Swifts were going into the building. And they were just so excited. They're like, wow, they use our chimney. This is our church. We love this place. And it, it sort of was this light bulb where I'm like, oh, we can get the communities that already use these buildings to care about these Swifts. And one other cool thing is we started telling them about the Swifts, and someone said, this church is like a sister church for a church in Peru. Like the ministers here are Peruvian, and we're like, oh, that's such a cool connection. So so that's something we really want to try to do in the future. But yeah, we kind of want to be a little sneaky about it too. So
I think building awareness and building community support is probably pretty key.
All right, we have a couple online questions. Yeah, we'll go with this and then we'll go back. Art, and this is you're gonna get a twofer. So one is, are nighthawks related to swifts, and do they nest in chimneys?
Nighthawks are not related to swifts. So swifts, swallows, and nighthawks. This is a, classic example of convergent evolution, where they're not genetic. And I would have to look at like a genetic tree to know how closely they're related, but they're not like directly related, but they use the same or similar ecological niches. So they're all aerial insectivores. They all have I'm going to just demonstrate, big gapes. It's called a big gape, the big mouth. And a lot of them have the whiskers that come out to the sides to help them kind of funnel insects into their mouths.
Sweet.
But they're not related. And I feel like I used to know where nighthawks nest, but I think on the ground. Yes. Nighthawks nest on
gravel rooms.
flat gravel. So in our case, as far as human-made structures, that can often mean flat rooftops that are covered in gravel. Thank you for that.
And nighthawks are in with like the whippoorwills and the porwills, and so that they're kind of in that group. The goat suckers, they're collectively called, which I
We
love
don't
saying
know.
that.
We don't know why.
All right, and then a follow-up to that is, and I think we've answered it a little bit. Do swifts use a chimney over and over, or do you need to clean your chimney? And a follow-up, is soot problematic for their nesting? And you answered that you weren't sure about the soot, but do they use a chimney over and over, and do you need to clean your chimney?
They do use a chimney over and over. And I think overall it's probably good to clean the chimney. I mean, you have to clean your chimney, right? You can't just not. Oh, or maybe not. I don't know. I was taught that you have to occasionally clean your chimney, but not during the nesting season. And I think if it's really cakey and sooty and gross, it might make their nest not stick very well. So I think overall it's probably good to clean your chimney, but I haven't like done a study on it. I don't know.
And they build a new nest every year. Like
Yes,
that,
thank you, Meg.
yeah.
Thanks for that.
like that nest isn't very structurally sound, and over the winter it just kind of disintegrates. And so, yeah, so they're, it's fine to clean your chimney and knock the old nest in because they'll build a new one.
Yes, thank you. That is important.
So are they actually nesting in the chimneys or are they roosting?
Yes.
How do
So
we know?
one pair will nest per structure, like per chimney, let's just say. They don't build a bunch of nests in there. So like one pair kind of claims it and is like, this is our spot. And they don't let other pairs build a nest in there, but they will let other individuals roost in there sometimes. And then basically during the whole active season, so from, April to September, they may communally roost in chimneys. So nothing to do with nesting, just they're all roosting together, but especially during migration. They all kind of start to congregate and use these well-known roost sites and they're kind of staging for migration.
And probably during the, when most of the breeding swifts are on their nests, there's still, a number of swifts that are, they're non-breeders or their nest failed or they're finding themselves and they're not ready to settle down yet, and so, you do get these communal roosts during the summer. It's just not in those huge numbers.
I got the microphone, so I'll go next. I live in St. Paul, full of masonry chimneys. One thing I've been thinking about, most of them are capped. Do we know at all if utilities are in them? If we uncap them, can they coexist? I don't really know what the utilities look like. And is there any science on can we change these current capping to reintroduce the swifts? Do we know?
I do not know the answer because I don't have a lot of information about what types of utilities may be run through an old chimney. I do know that a lot of chimneys got capped just because it was like, oh, you better cap that sucker, or animals are going to get in there. And you can undo that. It's not that hard to get the cap taken off. And if other animals are a concern, you can install metal flashing. I'm like I don't know if anybody can see me. You can install metal flashing around the chimney and that prevents squirrels and other animals from climbing up it. Because they're so small and they're so unobtrusive and they just make one little nest, I don't think that they would do damage to any infrastructure that was coexisting in the chimney with them. But I haven't studied that definitively, so I can't say that for sure. But like if I had a bunch of Wi-Fi cables and whatever, goodness knows what, running up my chimney, I wouldn't mind having swifts in there. Like they're just little bitty things. They don't do any damage.
When they are inside the chimney roosting, do they cling like a woodpecker?
Yes,
Yes, that's what I was.
they
wondering.
do.
And then do they have any favorite insects that they like to eat?
Ooh, that's a super good question, but I don't know the answer. What?
Oh,
Oh yeah, they only eat mosquitoes. Uh,
I know that they tend to eat really little bugs, so mosquitoes, midges, gnats, stoneflies, and they tend to eat stuff kind of higher up in the column. But yes, lots of mosquitoes. They like the little, they're not catching, cicadas. Although that'd be a good meal.
that would be amazing.
Let's see. I know. Oh, okay.
Hi. Okay, so I know that when developers are developing a parcel of land and they impact, like, say, a wetland, they're required to mitigate with like credits or something similar. Has the Fish and Wildlife Service or the DNR ever explored mitigating the destruction of chimneys for chimney swifts?
That's a really good idea, and I'm glad you brought it up because I'm gonna take that back with me. They're not a listed species. And so, and I do think that, overall aerial insectivores have fallen into that category that Mags 1 previously described of things that are common, but are not doing great. So I think that's a wonderful idea of like, okay, if you're gonna knock down this chimney, especially if we know that a bunch of swifts are using it, you have to do something else. But at least at DNR, we don't have any regulatory authority to do anything like that.
Yeah, and currently, on the federal level, we don't either. You can't destroy a nest while there's chicks or eggs in it, but, knocking down a chimney, that picture I showed you of the Elliott School, um, you know, even if they knocked it down during, when the Swifts were there, but the Swifts weren't in there at the time. So yeah, they didn't break any laws. But, Canada, the our southern neighbor, they have, and I don't know if it's all of Canada or just in Quebec, but they have recently passed some legislation saying that you can't take down older chimneys. They, I assume they have some sort of process of, replacing them, and but yeah, that just happened this last summer or recently.
Yeah, they're a few years ahead of us.
Yeah.
So we're looking to them, even though they're south of us, we're looking to them for guidance about ways to deal with this. Yes.
There are a lot of birds where the adults will carry the fecal sacs away from the nest. And since these chimneys have been used year after year, and we don't hear any complaints, I sort of assume that that might be part of why they would be welcome more than if they were like robins and putting it everywhere.
I think even robins will carry them away sometimes.
But do you know, when you look around, have you noticed if these probably are carrying fecal sacs away?
Sure. I don't have an answer to that. Partly it's been hard to study them because they're in chimneys and chimneys are up high and it's hard to see in there. But yeah, you could look underneath. It's possible that there are some records out there that might have information about that. I haven't come across them. One thing that we're really interested in is getting a game camera or a camera on a chimney that's being used for nesting so that we can learn about some of these things. Because right now, nest monitoring for swifts means sitting there and looking at a chimney and like, oh, they went in. Oh, it had something in its mouth. Oh, one went out, and it's what they're doing when they're in there. We really, we can make some assumptions, but we really don't know. But that's a really good question.
Yeah, there were, I've observed a couple chimneys like at Fort Snelling. And Fort Snelling they're so great. Like their insurance company wants them to cap all the chimneys and they're like, no, because we need to maintain the historic, integrity. And so, they really like the swifts. And they let me kind of, look up the chimneys, and it did not seem that messy. I mean, there were some sticks and they knocked some soot loose, but, it did not seem, there were some eggshell fragments. It did not seem very messy at all. So yeah, they may carry that away. But I don't know.
Have you, in Montemita, have you been in contact with anybody there? Like the Isaac Walton League has a pretty active chapter there, the Jaquet chapter. And they'd love to get involved in something like that.
I personally have not. I actually once was just to get permission to have a sit there, and they were like, yes, of course, you're fine. Another member of our group who works for American Bird Conservancy does have kind of a history of interacting with staff members at that school. So they are aware of it. Now that our group is becoming more active and our community science program rather, is starting to grow, I'd really love to get involved. Like, I think it would be super cool for a class to monitor a few times, or and especially if it could go year to year to year. I mean, I think it would be amazing. So if you have any specific contacts, I know you mentioned the Isaac Walton League. I would love to have that information. Thank you.
Early on, you were talking about how the population of swifts was mostly in the east and it moved west. It seems like it was like following people who built chimneys. I mean, that seems to be the conclusion you draw. So in early colonial, when chimneys were wood, which wasn't a very good idea, but it's probably a masonry thing. Is there any knowledge other than the wood ones, the Kyle's chimneys don't work, but is there more knowledge around masonry chimneys? It seems like it works, but
So you don't have a mic. Well, there is, one of the slides that Mags one has. Oh, do you want to jump in? One of the slides that Mags had does kind of show the westward expansion, and there is I guess I'll say an assumption that they were following Western structures, following settlement west as it expanded westward. I mean, they were been documented using human-made structures as early as like the 1600s.
But I mean, at the same time that we were building all these great things for them to nest in, we were also cutting down a lot of these old growth, snags. And so it's probably kind of a 1-2 punch where,
Yeah, and we don't have any information about what their populations were like way back when. So, did we actually provide structures that helped increase their populations or bolster their populations by building all these chimneys? Or was it more of a displacement situation where we cut down the structures they were using, or otherwise made them inaccessible, and so they had to switch to other structures? We don't have that information.
Two questions. One was just a simple one. Is eBird helpful to you at all or not?
It is, yes, because any information that's submitted to eBird definitely becomes part of the overall body of knowledge, and that is helpful. It's slightly less helpful to our program directly, because I don't right now have a method for getting that data and incorporating it and processing it into our database. So submitting it, if you see a roost, specifically roosting or nesting behavior, what is most useful to our program is to submit it to that online form.
Okay. Then two related questions. Is there any program that exists to open up capped chimneys that are on public buildings, or replacing existing caps with adaptive caps that allow swift access?
There is not that I know of. And I would like to add one thing to the previous question. iNaturalist also, like, entering the information anywhere is better than not submitting it at all, right? eBird, iNaturalist, both of those are good places to put data if you don't want to use, our specific online thing. And I don't know about any, to switch back to the most recent question, I don't know about any program to facilitate uncapping or modifying, but that seems like a good target for some grant funds in the future.
It looks like a really good ornithology PhD project.
Agree.
Yeah, there's in Dakota County, one of the service centers was a historic roost, and I went there to monitor it, and it had been capped since, in the last 10 years sometime. And because it's a county building, I was like, ooh, maybe we could see if they could uncap it. So yeah, it's, I think it's not a large effort, but I think we might be able to kind of get some toeholds here and there, and we probably need to make people feel comfortable, that if you uncap it, you're not going to suddenly have a bunch of raccoons.
Right. And, again, I think everyone in this room and everyone online, we can all do our part with awareness. If I go tell 3 people and they tell 3 people, I mentioned this previously, but I had a condo association email me, and it was through somebody in the audience. And half of the people in the building wanted to cap it, and half the people were like, oh, but there are swifts in there. And all they needed was some information, like, no, they're not destroying your chimney. It's fine. And they all voted to not cap it, to take measures to protect it. And so I considered that to be a really cool success.
Just a quick question. Do you think it would be helpful to get sort of a code design or something that works with building codes so that they could be comfortable with that? If you're thinking forward enough, you say, we know that this rebuild works well and doesn't cause this mischief, and get a kind of a standardized construction practice. Does that exist, or anybody else done that?
I don't know if anyone else has done that. I can't, the Birds Canada does have some information about that, but structures vary so widely that I think personally, I feel as though it's better to provide some generalized guidance, like put a cap, but it doesn't have to be exactly 31 centimeters. And if other things are a concern, add some flashing. And if you have a bunch of roofs coming together, you might have other considerations. If you have a flat roof, you might have other considerations. I feel like it's like providing those specific guidelines as far as as they might relate to building codes is a little bit beyond what we're capable of. But providing some generalized guidance is something that we can do.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
I appreciate everybody coming tonight, and I also appreciate all those at home that joined us, and I hope to see you next month. We'll go to Honduras. Yeah. No, that wasn't a promise, by the way. I'm not. Okay.